Howdy, howdy, y'all. Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to Some Antics. Today, I am joined by the one and only Adrian Roselli. Adrian, hello. Welcome to the stream.
Hi there. Thank you. And it's lovely to be in the stream.
It's
I don't know if
lovely to
that
have you.
matches.
I mentioned like on Twitter ahead of time that when I was starting my accessibility journey, like finding your blogs was one of the things that was like really instrumental to my understanding of accessibility and even to this day, like my approach to a lot of accessibility concerns. So I'm kind of geeking out actually a little having you on the stream. Um, so I'm super excited to have you on. For folks who haven't seen you around the interwebs yet, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. One of the things I've never been good at is an elevator pitch. So at a high level, hi, I'm Adrian Roselli. You might recognize me from way back in the late 90s running evolt.org as one of the owners, groupers, whatever of it, or being grumpy on my own blog, or being really loud and annoying on Twitter, or doing assorted conferences, talks, books, magazine articles, and so on. And if you've never heard of me, then yay, good for you. That's pretty much the and I have an independent contractor, or at least ran my own business for pretty much 25 years of my career, including this time that I've been writing all of these posts as well. So a lot of the stuff I've written about has been informed by interactions with clients and projects.
Absolutely.
I don't
And
know if that matters.
your work always seems to like really just focus in on the like underlying like HTML fundamentals, like getting a strong semantic foundation there. And then like careful, cautious use of ARIA is a big one as
Yeah,
well. Um, so yeah, do you want to kind of describe like what kind of stuff do you like writing about? Like what do you tend to blog about?
I yeah, I tend to blog about things that have made me angry. I mean, that's the simplest way to put it. And it's not quite accurate. Sometimes I'll blog about some silly thing I discovered or some new idea that I want to try out. But a lot of my deeper dives are a function of me having had so many conversations and so many fights with clients and so on that I I I'm tired of repeating myself, and it's easier just to write it all up, write up all those edge cases, all those corner cases, all those scenarios, and then put it out there. And one thing about the internet that I love is if you don't know something, you're not necessarily going to get good answers when you ask. But if you write about it, holy
Mhm.
crap, everybody's going to weigh in. So
Yeah.
one of my favorite things about the blogging approach is I write something and it goes through sort of a de facto peer review.
Yeah.
People will come up and say it doesn't work in here, or I do it this way, or my client wouldn't allow it that way. And that makes for some really interesting conversations, and forces me to sort of conceptualize other ways these things might work that I just glossed over when I was writing about it.
I feel like there was one of those adages of the internet that was, what is it, like the fastest way to get the correct answer on the internet is to post the wrong answer and wait to be corrected.
That's
Um,
pretty much how I live my life. Yeah.
but it that is like leaning into that a bit for the blog, right? To be like, here's what I've found has worked in my case. Allows folks to like come out of the woodworks of, as it were, to be like, well, that might be a strong start, but you know, in this other context I've been in, I found that this was actually necessary, or we had to do things slightly
Yeah.
differently.
Yeah. And what I think is really critical about that in the context of accessibility is accessibility is not a technical thing. I mean, there's so much technical that goes on behind it. The HTML you choose, whether or not you apply ARIA, which version of JAWS you're running, with which version of Internet Explorer, all of that is ultimately moot because accessibility is really about people. So all of these technical solutions, if you fall in love with them, well, you're making a huge mistake, because in 6 months, hell, in 6 weeks, considering browser release cycles, everything that you thought was true could be different because a new bug gets introduced, a new feature is released. So
Absolutely.
yeah, having that flexibility to know that it's going to change, I think, is really crucial to doing this work.
Awesome. Well, if for anyone who's looking like under and sees the title of the stream, I've got the word under engineered, and that's because I've kind of brought you on to talk a bit about my favorite series that you've done, which is your under engineered series. Can you kind of talk about like what that is?
Yeah, at a high level, it is me trying to find the absolute simplest way to do something with the smallest amount of code, simplest, smallest HTML, minimum CSS, absolute minimum JavaScript, which is different than no JavaScript, and still make it both usable and accessible.
Mhm.
And the advantage to that is I think it's a good way to demonstrate some of the free things that come with the platform and also show some of the gaps that exist when you don't use those free things, when you try to recreate them from scratch. And I still update these posts when I can. I still discover new and exciting things or stuff I failed to write about. I just updated one of these posts because the way to dismiss a native select menu on mobile is a particular gesture. It's basically the escape gesture. Like on Android with TalkBack, it's swipe down and left. And on iOS with VoiceOver, it's Z, Z. But if you do that when a select menu is open, cool, it closes and you continue living your life on that page. But if you do it with a custom select, an ARIA list box or whatever, it moves you back in the browser history. And
Mm.
that's that kind of little tiny nuance that is lost until you start really sitting down and comparing these things apples to apples and check those interactions. Again, the ARIA might be perfect, the CSS might be perfect, everything might be there, but there's still some core fundamental differences that you have to take into account and at least test.
Absolutely. Yeah, in fact, let me, I guess, start showing off the different articles that you've written because there's a whole series here. So it started with your like custom radio buttons and checkbox and but
Yeah,
there's
5 years ago.
yeah, toggles, toggles the sequel, text boxes, um, responsive tables. This one was a good one for an important one for me because in my previous role, I was working on a bank account transaction history page. So like you log into your
Hmm.
account, you go to like your checking account or whatever, you see all the transactions that have ever landed there, um, and that page was one big data table, and it needed to work
Yeah.
across all sizes, and we had a fairly over-engineered, I think, approach to tables that would change the whole layout at like mobile sizes, stuff like that. So that like you're meeting like real engineers' needs for like real complex sites. Do you have any particular favorites of these, or anyone that you'd like to like spend some time looking at?
I think probably my favorite is the under-engineered text box,
Okay.
because that one and it addresses text areas and text inputs, because that one is about as simple as it gets. Lots and lots of sites have text fields, and the CSS that you need in order to make it better is really 3 lines, and it could be so much more. I mean, it could be so much less if browsers natively inherited this stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for a text area and input, having font inherit means it pulls in the size, the family, the style, any variants, any weights, etc. Even the line height, which I think is pretty cool. You still have to add letter spacing and word spacing to inherit just in case. For some reason, those have been changed by you or the user. But right off the bat, your text areas and your text fields are easy to make adapt to your site design. And I keep seeing CSS resets that don't include some of these fundamental styles that really simplify how much work you'd have to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's just so little to this, but like yeah, instantly like this one already feels like it fits the branding a lot better. The size all just easy to just drop into a reset.
Yeah.
Then okay,
And
so
then I try to build on it,
what
which
is this trying to do here? You've got a
so
whole
yeah, that's not the prettiest selector in the world, of course. But this one is what, from 2019. In
Mhm.
2019, I still had clients using IE 11. Some larger financial institutions are still standardized back then on Internet Explorer 11. It's like, okay, so if I want them to be comfortable with this and be able to drop it into their applications, my selector needs to support that without blowing up. And IE 11 didn't support multiple attribute selectors within a not selector.
Mhm.
I hope that sentence made sense in context. It's weird to say. So, I
Absolutely.
build this complex selector, and then I start to do things like make the borders a little cleaner, give it a little bit of space inside, and then I continue to layer stuff on top of that for different states. How does it work when it's in error? How does it work when it's read only? Why are you using that? How does it work when you're in Windows high contrast mode? Basically, try to focus. That's a great one. Try to not necessarily tell you this is how you should do yours.
Mhm.
Like, don't take my styles. My styles are not pretty, but what they do is they show you the fundamental steps that you can take to layer on these features for these considerations, while also, I think, delineating the different considerations and states that you have to work through.
Yeah. And what I see here, like you're using some of my favorite tricks here, which is like using ARIA states or just even the like native like HTML attributes in general as part of your selectors. Because I've definitely seen like the alternative to this is like, oh, whenever you set ARIA invalid equals true, you also add a class that's like
Right.
invalid class or whatever. And you're kind of collapsing those into like one selector there.
Yeah, and that's partly because I always want to make sure that my programmatic state in this case is coming from ARIA, but can come from other things. I want my programmatic state to drive the styles because there's less of a risk that they will ever fall out of sync that way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I mean, that's
Um,
my hope.
yeah, and so what you've demonstrated here, right, with this post, like even just something as like seemingly simple as a text box, as you've taken like things that developers actually need to do, which is have a like reasonable looking text box. And you've shown them that they don't have to like boil the entire ocean to get, something that's flexible. You've got like right to left stuff like baked in, just kind of out of the
Mhm.
box. Um, Stuff like that. Like I love that. And then you build up to here's how you do more and more complex things. Like here's how you go beyond just the basics.
Yeah, you know, it got me thinking. I think at the bottom of one of my toggles posts has almost a checklist. Let me look on one of my screens. Um, yeah, under engineered toggles, there should be a bullet list at the bottom before the August 2019 update. And the reason I'm calling your attention to that, yeah, what this post covered. So I think it took me, 2 years to bother putting together this quick list of the things that I'm considering when I'm putting together a control, because I didn't
Hmm.
break it down as a list like in the 2017 post. I didn't make this list. I covered all these things, but I didn't break
Hmm.
it down as a list. But here I have things like making sure you're supporting disabled controls for checkboxes, support mixed state. I talk about the different WCAG success criteria, Windows high contrast mode, which is now contrast themes in Windows 11, which is now, which on the standards track is prefers forced colors, or is it just forced colors? Brain fart there.
Yeah.
But sort of leaning into that. So here are some styles and considerations there. Reduced motion, color scheme. I talk about roles to avoid. One of the things that I find a lot of developers tend to forget about, though, are things like right to left languages, or
Hmm.
basically any non-Western English language. And that's from my background doing localization work,
Hmm.
and also print styles, because I
Yes.
have watched people print forms to fill them out, to take them
Yeah.
to their parents, to fill out, to then bring back to type into the computer.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And there's just, yeah, this is stuff that like developers miss these a whole lot, right? Or they'll get like, maybe 5 of these, but they won't have all of them, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
I don't even have all of them there. And I think it's totally fair for developers to miss them, because if they're not doing this day to day,
Mhm.
how are they necessarily going to remember to do it? Do
Yeah.
they have a checklist that says, hey, as soon as you start to build a custom thing, here's the stack of stuff you need to consider. Here's what you need to walk through. And a lot of them, from my experience, don't. They are
Mhm.
spinning up. They're grabbing a basic material pattern, and then they are addressing that or modifying it or tweaking it in some way, which
Yeah.
leads to a ton of potential problems that way. So having this kind of checklist, at least for
Mhm.
me, is very helpful when I start to build, because I'm not going to forget something. It's
Yeah.
really easy to forget even this list, which I consider to be relatively short.
Yeah, and like my own personal experience, like I'm staring the words Windows high contrast mode dead in the eyes because, for the first few years of my career, I did nothing with high contrast mode. I wasn't even really like aware it existed, and I considered myself, pretty solid when it came to accessibility stuff. And so I think maybe some like repeat viewers here will know that I've started to do a little more with like explicitly showing off high contrast mode and forced colors mode. Because that was a gap in my own knowledge. And so even just seeing it in a checklist like this makes me, as a developer, go, wait, what is that? Is this something I need to be handling? Is this something I need to look into? Which I
Yeah,
love. I don't think there are enough resources out there that call attention to things like forced colors.
I tend to agree. I I also was a fan of CSS system colors way back in the 90s, because building we were building web-based applications that were supposed to look like Win32 applications, because our clients were nervous entering their truck. Shipping companies, for example, were nervous entering their truck information and driver information into a web page. But if you made it look like a Windows 32 form from system colors, they just happily type away without a care in the world.
Interesting.
That was a
Interesting.
weird tangent.
That's so human though, right? Like that's such a human like personal concern about, web experiences, right? Because it's not like any of the logic changed or the reliability of the form, but
Right.
like you used colors that they were already familiar with and they trusted it more.
Yes, we also found somebody in that organization who had the Windows 3 hot dog stand theme.
My condolences.
He was a weird guy.
Mhm.
Anyway,
All
I
right.
don't think he'd be watching this.
Anyway. Oh yeah.
Uh,
Um Yeah, active bit in the chat has put it succinctly, saying, "I know this, I trust this." For sure, for sure.
yeah, familiarity. Yep.
All right. Are there more parts of these that you wanted to look at, or I guess when you're looking at under engineering a thing, right? Starting
Mhm.
at those HTML fundamental, like how do you start? Where do you typically begin when you're trying to figure out like how do I build this the simplest way possible?
I start by looking for the HTML element that already does what I want, or at least is the closest fit. From there, then I build up to see how it behaves natively. And this is primarily with form controls. That's what I've done this around for the most part. The scrolling table is a little bit different from that, but
Mhm.
that still influenced it. But what are the native things? How do they work? And is there another way to do it that might be better? And if not, then what's the case, or what are the differences? In fact, if you pop over to the Underengineered multi-select,
Yes.
which is
Here it
my
is.
most recent one, that's one where um, the native select element supports multiple selection. I have never found anybody who finds it easy to use or understandable. So
Yeah.
my first thing was, I'm not going to use that, but there are already elements in HTML that do the job here. So I would look at a collection of checkboxes,
Hmm.
and cool. That's pretty straightforward, and you've got it there, and it just goes and goes and goes. So what would somebody experience in, say, a native application or in a non-native application with that many checkboxes? Well, they'd probably have it in a scrolling area. So I layer that onto it, get me that scroll. And then once it scrolls, I discover that people don't really like the field set. I like the field set. I think it makes sense. I'm not too concerned about trying to style it away. I think it just works. But I know a lot of people don't like the way field set and legend look, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a totally valid concern.
Mhm.
And then I look at what is available to me in HTML or ARIA that I can use to replicate what a field set does. And in this case, as you have it on your screen there, it's a scrolling box. It's a div with a group role. And I make sure there's an ARIA labeled by on it, and boom. Now I've essentially replicated what a field set does programmatically. And this is important because I don't want to exclude, in this very specific case, screen reader users. I still want them to understand it's a group, they're related, have a group name announced when they move into the controls or out of them, and have all of that appropriate context. But now I don't need to worry that field set, by that dumping field set is going to remove that. I just make sure that I replicate it to the best of my ability.
Absolutely. And then do you add more after? It looks like it's mostly just CSS stuff at this point, but
Yep.
okay. Then
And then I do the progressively enhanced one, which lots of people still want it to be collapsed. So, okay, let's use a disclosure widget. And if we're going to have a disclosure widget, let's make it so that I'm already using script at that point. So let's also do a count of how many items are selected, because there's 26 in there and it's a pain to scroll through them all, and make it dismiss on escape and stuff like that.
mhm. Yeah, and your code for this is still remarkably light. Like it looks to my eyes a little cluttered, but it's all just stuff like type equals checkbox, like a whole bunch of attributes that you need to have, and a whole bunch of possible options. Then you look at like
Yep.
your CSS, and this is overall fairly reasonable. A lot of this is getting things to look specifically the way you want rather than like simply
Yeah.
functional. Your script itself is, yeah.
Yeah, it's minimal, and I'm not even good at JavaScript. So I know it could be shorter like that. I would not call that production ready code by any stretch of the imagination, but it's more important for me to show those concepts,
Yeah.
because my experience is people aren't writing their own script anymore. They're usually pulling it into an existing library and leaning on features that are already available in the library to do this work for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
If you pop back over to that CSS tab, one thing I want to
Yeah.
call out there, which is a sort of a broader message. So I think if you scroll up, there was the gradient. So one of the so one of that gradient idea I have in there on all of my scrolling containers, because it shows a shadow at the edges as an additional visual cue. And I talk about some other visual cues in this post, like clipping the box so that cutting the box so that it clips some of the text. So there's obviously more there. But those shadows are a really nice touch that I stole from Leah Veru, for example.
Okay.
And then the left-right shadows from my scrolling table, I stole from Weijing Chen. And those are just two examples throughout these posts. One of the things I try to do whenever possible is reference where I got some of these ideas or code snippets or examples or inspirations or other people who've done similar things. For my select menu, I think I mentioned, was it, now my brain hurts, was it Stephanie Eccles who wrote one at about the same time, only hers was published 6 months before mine. I give Scott credit for stealing some ideas, Scott O'Hara credit for stealing ideas for some of the toggle stuff. I steal a bunch of stuff from Sarah Higley. Sarah Sweden gets a shout out because she has a variation on what I'm doing. The reason I'm saying all this is less for the name dropping and more for this notion of, I mentioned early on about this as sort of a de facto peer review. I think it's
Yeah.
really, really important that people who are doing accessibility in particular acknowledge where they got some of their materials, whether it's ideas, code snippets, icons, wrong opinions, good opinions, so on,
Hmm.
because we as an industry have been building on the backs of the people who came before us since this started. I've got 25 years experience doing digital accessibility now. It might be more. Crap. And all of that stuff is built on learnings I've had from other people
Yeah.
who've been around longer than I, and people who are brand new to this stuff.
Hmm.
And it's important not only to give them credit, but also to recognize where that stuff came from, partly because, again, technologies change,
Yeah.
patterns change, expectations change, and we need to be able to sort of spelunk our way back through the history of some of these assumptions and good ideas and bad ideas in order to continue to grow this stuff so it still works well for people. Because again, that's
Absolutely.
who we're ultimately serving.
Absolutely, because you run into the issue of, like, things that might have been solid accessibility wisdom 10 years ago are now superseded by, more modern browser options, as well as
Yep.
just new research into how disabled people use the web and what it is they like.
Yep.
And so even if you're, citing people, that doesn't necessarily mean you've got the latest, greatest, up to datest information. But then I've also noticed it, especially I seem to see this in kind of UI spaces, like visual design spaces, where um, folks will assert things loudly and with confidence that are based on their gut intuition about how things should be, rather than bringing in things from user research. Folks
Yes.
talking about, like, color contrast is when I see this, right? Where folks are like, clearly, this algorithm falls flat at this point without having backed it up with user testing.
Yeah, color contrast is interesting now that people are talking about the WCAG 3 version
Hmm.
of color contrast versus WCAG 2.1. And a lot of people are forgetting that the color spaces we work in have changed dramatically since WCAG 2 was released.
Hmm.
And it's interesting to see these fights spring up when in the end, listen, the color contrast is just a guideline. It is literally a baseline of how to not make something awful.
Hmm.
If your users are working on a plane where they can't shut the shade and the sun is coming in, you need to have really, really good contrast, like really high contrast. Otherwise, they're going to be stuck with the sun on their screen and not be able to get things done. So to your point, it's about adapting to the context, not necessarily to the specification.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, that's awesome. I love that. Were there more aspects of these that you wanted to show off or dive into?
I so if the under
Words are hard.
dependency questions. The
Yes.
dependency questions one is the one where I've gotten the most offline feedback, as in there are no comments on this post. This is the only one of these that has no comments, but I've had a lot of people ping me on the side and ask me straight up, why isn't there a live region? Why aren't you doing focus management? Why aren't you
Hmm.
doing all these other things? And this example that I came up with is a function of building it based on testing with end users, with keyboard and screen reader users in particular. And this notion that just because something appears on the screen, you have to have a live region, you have to manage the focus, and you have to do all these other
Hmm.
things is is fine when you're talking about more complex stuff. Those are things you need to consider, but
Hmm.
you don't necessarily need to do them. And starting from that position is you're already putting yourself at a deficit, or more accurately, you're putting your users at a deficit, because now just because I toggled a radio button, I'm going to hear 5 different things announced and my focus is going to be whisked over to some other part. No, sometimes the simplest thing that you can do is to do nothing. So this is an example where, and you were just showing it off there, if I'm choosing between animals, dog, cat, bird, griffin, and I work my way down to other, as soon as I choose other, a text box appears. That's it. It's real simple. And the nice thing about this it's so under-engineered, there's no JavaScript involved at all.
There's not even
Now
a
this is a,
tab for it. Yeah.
yeah, no JavaScript. This is a bit of an edge case though, because it requires you to have a really simple HTML structure, because I'm leaning on the adjacent sibling combinator in order to unhide that thing that was hidden. Yeah. So essentially when the radio button state is checked, that means that the following block of HTML is now visible. Otherwise, it's hidden. So I'm not even managing the display property other than none or whatever it is by default. So I don't have to worry about setting it to display block or stressing because it's in a flex or a grid layout. Really, it's just about I'm not going to hide it anymore, and it will just adapt to whatever the layout style is for that thing. But here again, I've chosen other. If I tab forward in a screen reader, I'm going to hear your pet and I'm going to know it's a text box. If I'm a keyboard only user, there it is. I'm not going to miss it. Same thing with pretty much any sighted user at that point. So this is a scenario where it might not be practical because of the HTML that you are dealt with. You might be working with somebody else's code. You have no way to change it. And I get that. But it's really an opportunity to look at what are some of the things that you can do that are simple and fundamental, that don't require a ton of extra code, and which just work, period.
Absolutely. Yeah, and like even if for whatever reason like the CSS doesn't display, right? Maybe the user's got like some custom user style sheets or something like that, or they're like the CSS asset fails to load, right? The worst
Right.
that happens is this field always appears.
Yep.
And that's not the end of the world, right? Like the fact that it hides when anything other than other is selected is like a nicety.
Yeah, exactly. It's a form of progressive enhancement, just by the way that you've coded it.
Mhm. Love that so much. This trick is very good.
It's,
And
you know
then
what, unfortunately, it gets utilized too much by people who want to use checkboxes to control the appearance of things like navigation.
okay.
And I don't think you should ever use a checkbox outside the context of a form. That's the wrong use for it.
Mhm.
But here, in the context of gathering information from the user, I think it's an appropriate fit.
Totally makes sense to me. Yeah. Um. Yeah. Oh, here's where you're calling out the specific tiles for that. Um. Yeah. I one thing. Stephanie Eccles is in the chat. She says here here. So, uh, one thing I've always loved about these articles is that you always call out like the individual pieces, the concepts that build up, like the building blocks for your approach, right? So that if I'm looking at this and if for whatever reason I'm not yet familiar with the sibling combinator, um, now I know kind of what it's doing and why you opted for that as opposed to an alternative, which is such a
Yeah.
hugely important part of communication around this.
Part of that, I want to clarify for the audience though, part of that is to ensure that I am getting it right.
Hmm.
Part of the reason I write this much detail is because I may have run through this code and discovered this thing for myself. By writing it, I'm offloading my memory. I don't necessarily need to remember the nuance. I just need to remember where it is on my site, which is just a quick search away. So it's offloaded memory. And it also ensures that I understand what it is I'm writing about. There's been more than one post I'm writing and I'm halfway through it and I look up something in the spec and I go, oh, well, this post is taking a hard left because this assumption I made is wrong. I'm still going to write the post and I'm still going to note this thing, but now I've learned something in the scope of writing this. And that's part of the reason why I'm pointing to a screen like I'm pointing to the audience. This is weird. It's part of the reason why I'm always linking to the specifications as well, because I want people to either look it up on their own and interpret it as they see fit, or to challenge me if my read of the thing is wrong as well.
So, what are some times you've been challenged and learned and adapted the material and stuff like that? How has feedback changed these posts?
So the text box one is a reasonably good one. Somebody had commented, why are you using this absurd not selector in your post? And I'm like, oh, I have a note in here around IE, but I don't remember what it was. So I had to go back because I took such crappy notes. I had to go back and track down what it was that made me choose that selector. And that's how I rediscovered that IE didn't like multiple selectors in the not. It was one of the comments toward the bottom.
Okay. Yeah.
But I've had a few people who've pointed out things in my posts that I could do differently. And what I like about that is it demonstrates a gap that I need to get better at. I've had people point out, hey, your selector is too specific. You know, I don't want a 501 selector. I want this selector. So I'm doing this. I'm like, cool. If it works for your audience, then absolutely do it. The stuff I'm writing here isn't necessarily the truth. What it is it's a walkthrough of how to achieve a thing based on my understanding, how it affects users, and all these other things that I've outlined in the post.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah,
And
there I am even saying, make sure you have a good selector.
yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Um, I'm trying to figure out what to ask next, and maybe this is a good time to call out to the chat. Chat, while we've got Adrian here, if you've got any questions for him, please feel free to let us know, and we will happily get to those. Um, you've got a comment from ActiveBit that says that the checkbox not checked trick was
You're
going
going
to
to
save
save
a
a line
line.
of JavaScript.
Yep, so good.
All it takes
Um,
is one line. If I can save just one line today. Wait, no,
you
I thought that
you
was saving children. I can't keep track.
if you save one line, it's equivalent to saving one life. You've heard it here first.
I
Adrian
like that.
Roselli said it. You can attribute it to him.
We'll go with that.
Lines of JavaScript are equivalent to actual children.
Oh, I'm going to stop there because there are a lot of weird value judgment jokes I want to make, but yeah.
Mm.
You know what? Do
Yeah.
you which one I added a video to the multi-selects.
Yes. Okay.
Toward the bottom of that post, I think, is that where I did the video show? Yes. So I have a video there showing the oh yeah, you pulled it up. I was busy looking on my other monitor. So this shows the progressive enhancement that I was talking about before with that last version of the pattern that works as a disclosure widget. And first I show how it operates with no JavaScript. And I intentionally did the no JavaScript version first, just so you could see, oh yeah, that works fine. And then layering on the JavaScript after the script loads, then it does things like collapse the box, implement the counter, dismiss on escape, and whatever other features that I want as well. And to me, that's a big part of this concept of underengineering, is building that fundamental so it just works.
Mhm.
And as you layer things in, you're layering on enhancements, which is really the whole concept behind progressive enhancement.
Absolutely. Um, so I guess what would you I've genuinely had this question asked of me before. Like in my previous role, I was doing a whole bunch of React, right? What would you say to someone who maybe doesn't quite appreciate the importance of progressive enhancement? Like how would you make that pitch for them?
Yeah, so the thing is that's something that you have to approach on an almost individual basis. You have to understand what their objection is.
Mhm.
And those objections vary wildly. Sometimes people don't understand that a lot of users are on crappy systems or on underpowered systems or on taxed systems. Sometimes they forget that there are users who don't use things the way they do. Sometimes they are afraid that they might have to do more work outside of their preferred technology stack. Like, hey, I can do this with material design, but the moment that you tell me I have to move the label, that blows everything up because now I have to change all my code and maintain it. So it's really a question of understanding the objection before I try to work my way through it. And I think that's important because some of those objections are valid. And I don't want to say that progressive enhancement is absolutely the only way to do things. Somebody might raise a valid objection, in which case you say, you know what, you're right. In this context, for your audience, for your use case, for what you know, don't worry about it. And running at it just by saying, no, progressive enhancement is always right, is already starting from a false assumption. And I want to make sure I understand what the scenario is, and then if or how it might apply in that scenario.
Absolutely. We have a question in the chat from Adrian Engine who wants to know, do you add your ARIA attributes from the start on the HTML, or do you add them when JavaScript is activated with JavaScript?
So that depends on what it is the thing is doing. In the case of that, this under-engineered multi-select that we're just looking at, I still need the group role on it because it's still a box that has a scrolling thing on it. So I still need the ARIA there. The ARIA expanded, though, on that button, I don't add until the JavaScript fires, because I don't want a user who's come in where the JavaScript is blown up. Excuse me. I don't want that user to think that activating that button is going to do anything. So for the static things, yeah, the ARIA will go in there. That scrolling container is static. For the dynamic things, the ARIA gets layered on after the script fires, and only to reflect that that thing is now functional.
Since that is a great question, Adrian. Sorry, Adrian Engine in the chat. So many Adrians these days. They're
I'm
just
just
everywhere.
thrilled there's another Adrian out there, because I got to tell you, we're all a pile of jerks, and we need nice ones out there to make us look good.
Well, it's a good thing that Adrian Engine, our beloved viewer, is not a jerk. He can represent represent the Adrians well in the Council of Adrians.
I really want to know what an Adrian engine powers. Is
Ooh.
it the engine in the Adrian? Does it make more Adrians?
Yeah,
Is
Adrian
is it a
Engine, if
style
you
of
can tell
engine?
us what the backstory is behind your username, I would love
I'm
to
curious.
hear that. Yeah,
It's
what
powered by rage if it's just me.
absolutely.
It's
Um,
sorry to put him on the spot like that.
I I mean, I did it too, so we'll see.
Eh,
Yeah, if you wanted
whatever.
to share the backstory behind your username, I'd be super curious. Yeah, and if anyone else in the chat has any questions about kind of this approach, please feel free to let us know. Um, oh,
There's a
okay.
question. What do I think of details? That is indeed a great question. I think details is a brilliant native content disclosure widget. I think it does a good job of letting you adjust content dynamically in the page when it needs to be hidden. I will sometimes use it to hold an animated GIF because it's a very quick way to hide that animation without having to
Mm,
strap on a pile of script. So it can be really powerful in that way. But once you start to make details and summary do more, like act like a menu navigation, act like a dialog box, I think you're starting to get outside of what its intended purpose is. And then there's still the fact that details summary announces differently in screen readers than a disclosure widget, which is basically a button with ARIA expanded. And you have to keep in mind for your audience what that disparity in announcement might mean to them, particularly based on their experience on other sites, and if you're mixing those controls in the same context within your own site. So I think
mm.
it's a really powerful element, but I think there's some, not high risk, but some risk associated with it. And to your question about, is it possible to make it announced differently? Yeah, I think you can. No, wait, that we can rely on? No, because the summary element still has the implicit button role, and it is still being announced differently. And I'd have to test it, but I suspect throwing a roll button on it isn't going to change things.
Gotcha. And Adrian Engine wants to know if you have any thoughts on whether the dialogue element is safe to use and what your thoughts are on the element.
I think the dialogue element is safer to use than it ever has been, provided you have good inert support in the browser. But to caveat that statement, you really need to know that your audience is using the most modern versions of browsers. And I say this because I know that that's not always the case. I work with clients who don't let their employees update their Chrome releases every time a new one comes out. They stage them. They have to wait 6 months. They have to go through some sort of internal review, whatever. So just because Chrome or Firefox or Edge might be on a 6-week deployment cycle, I have clients where their users are running at least 10 versions behind at a time. And I've got mobile users who are still visiting my site in the Chrome version 40s. And I'm just using Chrome as an example because it is currently the most popular browser. So yeah, dialogue is better than it has been, but I wouldn't be rolling it out en masse yet without knowing a lot more about your audience. And yes, there's a polyfill for inert, which is what I use in the places where I've used the dialogue, not the dialogue element, but for using inert in general, where I am using with a fake dialogue. Scott O'Hara in particular has written a ton of good stuff about the dialogue element. So I would encourage you to look up what he's written. And here's a great bit from Eric Bailey about Evergreen not meaning immediately available. Because as I was saying, it doesn't mean people have the most recent release at any given time.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think we're starting to see this too as like WebKit ships with you know, I think it was Has was the one recently. Like yeah, just because, the latest versions of browsers have the cool whiz bang semantics and CSS and whatnot, like doesn't necessarily mean it's quite right. And then even then, like they can still ship with bugs, especially when it comes to accessibility. Like, we're no stranger to like. I think part of the reason Dialogue, has been so fraught over the past few years was because it initially shipped with a whole bunch of like accessibility defects and whatnot. Like, it wasn't accessible out of the box. So
Yeah.
even if it's out there and has been out there for a while, doesn't always mean that those things are like ready for prime time.
Right. And you can even, you can go to WhatWig and see a huge discussion between two people who manage the WhatWig spec and at least 20, I think it's about 20 accessibility experts and disabled users who are telling them that the way that the spec says to manage focus is wrong, but they're still anchored on the Windows 95 style of surfing the web, which makes it kind of difficult when they're trying to create platform parity in a web paradigm. It creates some friction. The users might say they want it, but we'll be darned if we're going to give up what we experience in Windows 95.
It's Windows 95 or bust. User experience is peaked in Windows 95. That's why there's not been any new Windows since then.
Best operating system ever. And if you don't believe me, go look at the ARIA practices guide, because you can live in Windows 95 for as long as you want. Did I say that out loud? Hey, we have another question. Somebody's asking, would I consider explicitly supporting Internet Explorer on sites targeting the quote general end quote public? Short answer to that is, that's a very broad question, but no. I have mostly moved away from supporting or stressing about Internet Explorer. First of all, if you're building something for the general public, you should already know what your audience makeup looks like. And you need to make a decision about how many IE users are coming to your site, and if that matters, but also why they might be on that platform. So you need to make this decision based on your audience, is what it boils down to.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that you might be doing something that blocks those users, which artificially deflates their numbers in whatever tracking tool that you're using.
Also,
on top of that, Microsoft is finally sunsetting it next month, but that doesn't mean that everybody's old computers are going away.
yeah. And it's worth calling out too. I think that there are, multiple general publics. Like there's no one public that we can really talk
Mhm.
about. It's like, you know, you and I, we have like web developer blogs. Is very unlikely that most of our viewers are going to be on Internet Explorer because most of our viewers are likely to be web developers who were
Right.
probably more prone to be on newer browsers. Um,
Yeah.
but like, yeah, Amazon or Walmart, right? Like those are sites that perhaps do target a more general population, but even then, I think they still have to make that choice. At my previous role, we served military members. We built our products
Mm.
for military members. What that meant was that we were actively considering military bases where the browser you can use is much more locked down, and as a result, like we had artificially inflated IE numbers for a while.
Yeah. So that they were the ones keeping the numbers up in the global stats. I
Yes.
know that the local blind association only within the last couple of years finally got rid of some of their older computers, but they might still have one or two machines sitting in the back still running IE, partly because they also use them as legacy systems, but they were available to their constituents to use.
Hmm.
So there are plenty of people who don't have a computer who are reliant on whatever their local support organization is able to provide for them. So again, general public, if we're talking about a US based desktop environment, probably, but once you get outside of that, it gets a lot muddier.
Gotcha. Right. Chat. Any more questions for Adrian while we've got him? Um, if we've got a few more minutes. We can probably take one or two more questions.
I'm I'm going to ask you a question
Yeah.
then. Are you familiar, or I'm going to rephrase this. Do you use Caret browsing ever in your browser?
I'm sorry. Caret browsing. Is that what you said?
Yeah. Yep.
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Okay, that's good. Um, so, uh, so humor me for a second. And the underengineered tables post
Yes.
has that whole thing about making an area scroll, the responsive tables. And the whole reason that we do that, browsing for carrots, almost, but not quite. The whole reason that I do that is because the whole reason all that code is there is because a keyboard user needs to be able to make a scrolling region on the page scroll.
Hmm.
The thing is, in order to make it happen, you have to give it a tab index. Once it has a tab index, it needs to have an appropriate role and accessible name. And now you've stacked up this verbose interface for a screen reader user.
Mhm.
Like you have to add this ARIA on top of it in order to not break the experience for a screen reader user. But the outcome for that screen reader user is that it's very verbose. If they're a blind screen reader user, they don't care that your region scrolls. It doesn't matter to them. The way around that, though, is when users rely on Caret browsing. My experience, and I asked this on a Twitter poll yesterday and is feeding into a blog post I'm partway through writing. What I'm trying to do is understand who uses Caret browsing, and could we, in some circumstances, rely on users navigating with their keyboard, which is what Caret browsing is. It's just moving your
Okay.
cursor through the page like in a Word document. Could we rely on users navigating with the keyboard to get rid of all this extra screen reader verbosity? And that's what I'm exploring in my next blog post, which is
Mm.
me taking this very broad statement I make in this post about scrolling regions and introducing some nuance,
Okay.
which
Gotcha.
will be fun.
Yeah. We do have a question in the chat from Adrian
Yeah.
Engine. It looks like actually probably two questions. Any thoughts on the accessibility object model or on how to make Canvas 2D or 3D experiences accessible?
I have a lot of thoughts on the accessibility object module, but I'm cautious about them because a lot of them are sort of knee jerk. My biggest
Mm.
concern is really what it boils down to. There are a ton of things about the accessibility object mod AOM which I think are useful and valuable and can simplify development and improve the experience for users. But my biggest concern with it is that it will give developers a way to probe the assistive technology that users are using. And I consider that a huge privacy issue. I consider that a breach. And if anybody can detect what assistive technology I'm using, that means they can shunt me to a different experience. And I am not a fan of that. Now, I'm not staying abreast of AOM, certainly not as much as I should be, but I know the people who have been participating in it are aware of those concerns because they have those concerns as well.
Leonie Watson, I
So
think, is a prominent example of that.
Leonie, basically, if here's the thing, I will follow Leonie wherever. And if Leonie says this is good and I'm comfortable with it, I'm going to trust her almost implicitly because she has been fighting this and she does have these genuine concerns. But she definitely sees the value in it. And I would defer to Leonie in particular about her take on this. And then separately, Canvas 2D or 3D experiences, that's a lot trickier. Partly because each experience will be different and I'm wary about throwing an application role on everything. And there is where the AOM becomes probably most useful anyway to dynamically assess, evaluate, and update the content. And I don't know that I can give you a good answer without going into more detail and starting to get into some of that nuance.
Gotcha. And another question asks, can you share your thoughts about visual screen reader users and in particular with regard to hidden skip to content links? Also, hello, Jeremy.
Hey, Jeremy.
Yeah. I guess like cited screen reader users and yeah, stuff like that.
I am a fan of skip links and I am a fan of having them become visible when they take focus. And for a cited screen reader user, my experience testing with them and working with them is that as long as it looks like the rest of the site and isn't broken in some way, it's not a concern for them. So the way I do it on my site, for example, it's not visible until you put focus on it, and then it will jump you down to the content of the page. I think it works fine. I expect in time we will find new and exciting ways to do this. That might be better. There we go, skip to content. Maybe I shouldn't keep it anchored in the left corner for wider windows because that does fall outside of the, if you're using a screen magnifier, that would fall outside of the magnifier window. So that question already is prompting me to say, hey, I haven't looked at it on a big screen. Maybe I should adjust that. So for a little bit of extra nuance to that answer, yeah, I think they're valuable. They're more valuable though when they appear where you're looking.
When they appear when you're looking, like as
where
in
you're
they.
looking.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of cited screen reader users will use a magnifier. Not all of them, not people who rely on screen readers for dyslexia, etc. But you certainly don't want it to appear too far off the screen.
Yeah. What I've got on mine is it's like smack dab in the like center of the top. For whatever reason, the internet's slow, but yeah, it appears right here. So I think that would be difficult to miss, perhaps. But
yeah, it's pretty difficult to miss. I'm thinking about it in the context of a screen magnifier, which isn't quite what they asked, but that's where my head went once I saw how far off it was from my navigation.
Right. And then another question from Mayank, who wants to know, other than the ARIA practices guide and bespoke blog posts, is there a good, reliable resource for developing accessible components? Even ARIA practices guide is questionable a lot of times.
Yeah, I often will end up with the UK digital services, government digital services, or whatever it's called, uk.gov. They have a sharp team over there. I have met a bunch of them. I've worked with some of them, and they have written up some good explanations for why they have done things the way that they did them. And they have a mandate that's different than a business, which is namely, be available to everyone. So they have some good patterns, and because they explain them, you can make a decision on whether or not it's a good fit for you. So I think it's a good resource. Hayden Pickering has his inclusive components, which is definitely a good start. I don't agree with all of them, and that's not a problem. Just like if he reads my stuff, he shouldn't agree with all of them, because each of these patterns needs to remember the context of the user and what they're trying to do.
Absolutely.
I always look at stuff Sarah Higley writes. I look at Scott O'Hara's incredibly deep pile of patterns and examples. It's incredibly rich. And every time I think I'm coming up with some new idea, he's already built one, which is infuriating because it's done already.
I gotta say,
But he's definitely a good
yeah,
resource.
I gotta say, part of that is I know that so I actually get to see him quite a bit because he runs office hours, accessibility office hours at Microsoft, and I like to drop in and see what he's talking about. And yeah, teams will come in with like, hey, there was this, finding on our page, how do we resolve this? And he ends up getting a breadth of just different experiences as a result. Super cool to listen to his thought process. He's someone I want to get on the stream at some point as well.
You should ask him to do it during his office hours, and then, oh my God, he's going to kill me if you tell him this is my idea. But then he can't say no because you're just streaming his office hours.
There we go. There we go. Yeah, I mean it's basically just part of work at that point. Um, Adrian, this has been delightful. Thank you so much for your time. Is so you mentioned that you're working on a post about keyboard navigation and Caret mode. Are there other things that you're working on that you'd like to take some time to promote, or things that you just in general want to shout out, or places you want people to follow you?
Well, I'm on Twitter and I have my blog. I don't bother with LinkedIn. The other social media platforms don't really interest me. So Twitter is the best way to find me. My blog is open for comments. So, leave comments, ask questions, correct me when I'm wrong. But for the most part, the only thing I really want to shout out is pay attention to users. Just because a user doesn't have the right terminology or might not understand how to fix a thing, the more that we're listening to the users, the better. And then subsequently listen to the developers who've gotten beat up by the users, because they probably have some really good experiences. I just want to make sure that as an industry, we don't get anchored on the notion that there are a few voices worth listening to. If all you listen to is me, that's terrible. It's a terrible disservice to everyone. There are a ton of people out there doing this work every day. A lot of people who don't have a voice. And when I say don't have a voice, they don't have a platform. They're not appearing on your program, Ben. They're not doing talks or other things, who are closer to this on probably a day-to-day basis and dealing with much more fundamental issues. So don't get hung up on what one person says. There's a lot more experience out there, and credit them whenever and wherever you can, because we need more people to be doing this work and to feel rewarded for doing it as well.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. Hey, chat, stick around. We are going to find someone to raid, some other streamer. But also, while you're following folks on Twitter, go follow Some Antics on Twitter. That way you can keep abreast of all the streams when I remember to schedule the announcement tweets. Sorry about that, Adrian. I was way later than I usually am on promoting.
I panicked and thought it was next week.
Oh, I'm sorry. Speaking of next week, though, we're bringing on Mads. Mads works for Backlight.dev, which works in design systems. We're going to be talking about building design systems with web components, so leveraging the web platform to its potential. So if you want to keep apprised of all of those streams, go follow Some Antics on Twitter, follow Some Antics here on Twitch, and thank you all for being here. This has been a great time. And thank you again so much, Adrian.
Sure. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for asking questions. And I think this is when I'm supposed to stop talking.
Yeah, something like that. Bye, y'all. See you next Tuesday. Bye.
Cheers.